Alright guys, welcome to the open semi-finals of 7 Malaysian debate open. We have on site now the High Chinese. With Xiaomei, John, and Albert. And on site opposition we have Yukivihamai. Representing quite obviously of Yukiviham and Mai. I request members of the audience to please improve their self on silence, and if you'd like to leave the room, please do so between and not during speeches. On the motion, this House believes that Indonesia should grant clemency to Australian citizens convicted with the death penalty in exchange for the Australian government opening up their borders for refugees. I now invite the Prime Minister to begin the case to the motion of Clemency.
The reality is we think that this particular trade only means good for for all the parties that are involved in the transaction. The only issue is this, that even though both sides, both Indonesia and Australia, both have good reasons as to why they want to make these concessions, we think the problem or reason why they haven't done these things yet is because there's never been an available opportunity for them to be able to do things like open their borders to refugees or pardon these individuals in the face of like real political conditions that happen in their own country. We think what this deal does is gives them the ability to make these particular concessions and allow for better relations between the two countries, while at the same time having lots and lots of attendant benefits for all those involved. We're going to talk about this debate on two levels. One, we're going to tell you why necessarily we think this deal is likely to happen and why is it that both countries will make these trade-offs. And then we're going to tell you why it's good for both the refugees and for both Australia, and it's both in Australia and Indonesia interest as well. One, why do we think that this deal will happen? We think that we think Australia has a respect for like human life and like basically the idea that they don't stand for the idea of the death penalty. So as a result, there's been lots of like noise coming out of Australia, no thank you, about the idea of these individuals or their citizens being put up on death penalty because of their own belief in rehabilitation. We think they have an interest, therefore, in saving these individuals and like standing up to their principles of ensuring that their own people are not put to death, especially if they have been proven to have been able to rehabilitate. Secondly, we think that Indonesia has interest in these cases as well, because we think that one, these are not prisoners that cause a massive amount of harm in their country, but more importantly, we think they have an interest in like making sure that Australia opens its borders to refugees. So thank you, because of the like huge number of refugees that would otherwise be on Indonesian soil, like causing a strain on their resources as well. We think that the reason why they haven't done this yet, or like why neither side has gone through these actions, because one, Indonesia is incredibly afraid of looking as if it's bowing down to Western powers. They do things like give clemency to these individuals, and like just because Australia asked them to do it. What we think this particular deal does is that it offers them or gives the impression that there is an exchange involved, that both countries are able to negotiate on an equal playing field, and then neither side is the losing end. No, thank you, madam. So for this reason, we think both countries are very likely to jump at this opportunity to be able to show that they are like equal powers, and at the same time get the kind of benefits that are involved in this particular deal. So why is it then that we think that this is a good policy to have? One, we need to recognize that this is an incredibly pressing issue on the issue of refugee welfare, right? Because what happens right now is that oftentimes refugees have no other option and no other place to go. No, thank you, madam. And they see Australia as like a haven for these individuals to be able to improve their lives, and a sanctuary for them to escape the kind of oppression that goes on in their own country. The problem is that Australia has very strong political antagonism towards the idea of like taking in refugees, right? To the point in which they send out boats to stop the refugees from entering their own waters, and oftentimes even doing things like incursions into the territory of their other Southeast Asian neighbors in order to stop these individuals from coming in. The problem then is this: one, either the refugees end up dying because like their boats are pushed back onto sea, or they end up in Indonesia, right? A country that is a decentralized government that is not able to provide any form of services or any form of like protection for these refugees, where their life is inevitably a hellhole. Either that, or they get sent to places like Christmas Island, for instance, where the Australian government spends the minimal to ensure that these people have any form of standard of living at all. Why is it that we think we change this? When Australia is forced to open its borders to these particular refugees, what we think will happen is that because there are more of these individuals, they are forced to spend more on things like infrastructure, for instance, to ensure that these people have a dignified standard of living. Couple that with the fact that when they officially want to open their borders to these individuals, there's going to be media scrutiny to force this individual or force the government government to really ensure that the level of welfare in these places is better. But also like just the sheer number of refugees also ensures that things like, for example, like procedures for better integration of these refugees into the country or into like the living of these individuals happens, and we think that thank you, it creates better conditions for these people. Like as a whole, right? So we think that in the instance of refugee welfare, we think it's an absolute necessity, and we need to ensure that Australia does do this, that Australia does open its borders in contrast, and like ease the burden of Indonesia that is not able to offer these people a place to live in. Yes.
It's so falsy to say that there was no opportunity for us to reverse the stop the votes policy. When A, we have massive international pressure for the Abbott government to change it, and B, Tony Abbott finally lost the popularity for the last few months. Why should we make a concession when the Australian government should have done what they're actually supposed to do on the safest floor?
No, so if that's the case, right, if you agree that your Australian people do want these changes to happen, then you also need to recognize that right now the reason why this isn't happening is because politicians are hamstrung by the fact that they have to pander to certain individuals and like continue on with this stop the votes policy, right? We think what this allows is for the opportunity for the Australian government to make these particular concessions without being seen as if they are backtracking on backtracking on things that they've said before, and allows them to show or see or like look as if they are equal partners in this particular negotiation. So why did they go for Australia? It's precisely because of this reason, right? Like most of the time, or oftentimes in Australia, the problem now is that most people are not aware of just how bad refugee conditions necessarily are. No, thank you, madam. Or like they're not actually happy with this stop the votes policy. The problem is that politicians like Tony Abbott, for instance, are forced to pander to like, for example, far right individuals who are like grossly against the idea of like refugees being able to come into their borders. We think the reason why this is good for Australia is that now what we allow it to do is that we allow politicians to be able to make that particular concession, to go with the will of the people or the will of like a vast number of people, and say that we are willing to go back on the stop the votes policy and accept these refugees back into our country. No, thank you, madam. More importantly, given that Australia has a huge respect for things like a dignified standard of living, for instance, we think that it's been a stain on the conscience of Australia for so long to have this stop the votes policy to begin with. No, thank you. We don't understand why this deal shouldn't come about as well. Finally, and why is it then that we think, and lastly, why is it then that we think this particular deal is good? Additionally to that, we also think that given that, no thank you, Australia has constantly been seen as to be very against the death penalty, right? They believe in things like rehabilitation. We think what happens now is that this particular trade-off for the clemency of these individuals is important to them because these individuals that have been put on the death penalty are prime examples as to why exactly Australia's stance on rehabilitation is the right one to go. Like the prisoner that was sent to that particular prison, for instance, was able to rehabilitate himself, shown that they have been like on good behavior, and even did things like learn additional skills while they were in the prison, right? Do things like, for example, create artwork or became an artist creating artwork detailing their lifestyles in prison, and like were able to like garner lots of attention on that. We think these individuals are prime examples and show or help Australia show why its particular style of rehabilitation is so particularly effective. Lastly, why do we think that this is good for Indonesia as well? We think that the problem, right, Indonesian and like Australian relations, right? We think that what happens now is that when this trade-off is being made, it necessarily allows the relations between these two countries to be a lot better. And the reason why this is important is because these two are the largest countries like in closest proximity to each other. What happens when they are constantly in a standoff or political standoff against each other is that we think that the kind of like decisions or political decisions that are made as a result of that have attendant negative consequences on everyone else that lives in that particular country. So when Australia says things like, for instance, we don't want to give aid to Indonesia because of the way that like they continue to hold our prisoners on death penalty, we think that has massive consequences for people in Indonesia as well. So we think that good relations between these two people or these two countries is good for all. For these reasons, Madam Chair, we propose.
I'd like to try to for a speech. I now invite the leader of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we think this is a highly unfair trade-off that's happening. We agree from our side of the house that Australia should be pressured holistically on a global scale to save these people and to change the policy that they have. But we don't necessarily think that Indonesia should be forced to concede on their own sovereign legal principles just because Australia is doing something wrong and just because we want to change Australia. We don't necessarily think Indonesia should be forced to concede on that point. We don't think this debate is necessarily about whether the death penalty in itself is right or wrong. What we're protecting from our side of the house is their decision to have it as a legitimate sovereign decision within their state, and that's something we support from our side of the house. I think it's problematic when these states, when Australia or Indonesia uses human lives as a weapon to force other states to change policies that your citizens do not like, and that's something we are against, right? I think that the power to change domestic or foreign policy should exist under that one sovereign state, and moreover, we're happy to, as we said, to have international pressure and condemnation, but using the loss of human lives as a tool to force that change is something we are against, because it further undermines the credibility of a sovereign nation in itself to make its own decisions. I think that's problematic. We support from outside the house. We don't think that Indonesia should be held hostage to Australian demands on the first instance, but secondly, we don't necessarily think that Australia should need favours in order to take the right stance, right? Because from their side of the house, what we heard first is that, well, they have not had that opportunity yet to make a change, right? We agree, we completely contest this from our side of the house, right? Because the Australians and the inhumane refugee policy that they have is something which the Australian people do recognise right now. As Mai pointed out, the change that's happening within the political sphere, within the citizens and their mindset, is something that you need to recognise, right? We need to understand that the bottom-up change within society is something that can be achieved. When Abbott was first placed into power, it was based on that xenophobic idea, and the rhetoric was that the refugees are jumping queues, and so on and so forth. But we see in the status quo how people have recognised that that's something completely wrong, and how the support for Abbott has completely decreased. We're going from a landslide victory to close to 20% support right now. Moreover, we recognise the fact that Australian citizens are against inhumane policies as well. Case in point being the SNS and the boycott banning policy, which clearly shows they are against these issues which are inhumane in itself, right? We can understand in states scope how people are quickly picking up the sentiment against these refugee policies in itself. I wouldn't necessarily think that this is something that Indonesia needs to concede to in order for this benefit to happen. What this means is that Indonesia gains very little from doing this trade-off, because they're going to get their end goal anyway if you leave it. We think it's problematic when you consider the fact that this is a policy that's a shared global problem and it requires global responsibilities. But we think it's problematic when you place the sole responsibilities to solve it onto Indonesia as a sole actor. I think that's something we do not like from our side of the house, right? We think that it's also a problem for any countries like Myanmar, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And moreover, we think from our side of the house that refugees that exist in Indonesia is a minority of the whole refugee populace that necessarily exists. But even if it is the majority, right, from our side of the house, we think that the abolishment of this policy in itself still benefits a lot of people, and therefore we don't necessarily think that Indonesia should be the sole actor making that sacrifice in the first place. From our side of the house, we agree with 5 minutes of the PM speech saying why it would be better for Australia to open up its borders. We agree from our side of the house. What we differ in this debate is the method you achieve it, because we think that their way of doing so is going to create massive problems. They also see changes not happening, but as I said, the local politicians are the ones that need to listen to the local sentiments in the first place, and when you consider that local sentiments are changing, we think that change is something that you can achieve. But moreover, they then said they need to be principally consistent. Why then are they only pushing for this? Why are they pushing or lobbying against Malaysia and so on that also have this? It clearly shows that they only want the clemency in this instance, are not necessarily pushing for the principal structure. So from our side of the house, firstly, we're going to tell you how the sacrifice is not legitimate, right? We need to recognize the fact that the Indonesian law in itself that place the death penalty is a law made for their people, reflective of the sentiments of the Indonesian people in the first place. We think that that's problematic when that's something that needs to be sacrificed in order to force Australia to do the right thing, which is a complete different trade-off, which Australia also recognises from their citizens that it's something that needs to change. But more, we think this is problematic because this trade-off grants a moral legitimacy to the Australian policy itself. Because now you're saying this was the policy that needed a concession from another sovereign state to restrict its own sovereign abilities for this policy to be taken away. When you consider the fact that this is something blatantly racist and horrible and xenophobic, the policy itself, we don't necessarily think that this trade-off should even exist in the first place. Something that is rather problematic when you rather support that policy and give moral credibility to policy such as this. No, thank you. But moreover, from our side of the house, we need to also understand the legitimacy of the death penalty within these sovereign nations, within Indonesia itself. We're not saying from our side of the house, as I told you, that it's a right policy. We're not making a judgmental call. We think that it's legitimate for a state to have these death penalties within that state if that's what the populace within that nation wants, right? We think that it's legitimate for Australia also to lobby against them through discourse and also create a platform that still allows Indonesia to make that final free decision. But this method is something we oppose from our side of the house because now you're holding a sovereign government hostage by saying, unless you do this, the other alternative is death for these people. And that's something we think is problematic from our side of the house, right? Moreover, we think this is also problematic when you consider the fact that you have the complete backbone of the international community itself, because the prerequisite of an international community and for nations to exist in an international community is that you respect their sovereignty and you respect their sovereign rights that they have. When you have examples like the WTO and the free trade laws, I think it's problematic when you go about undermining that sovereignty in itself, saying it's something that can be restricted in order to force other people to change, to get a foreign policy different, and we think that's problematic, yeah.
Do you think, in principle or a vacuum, that it would be a good thing if these people were not the party 9 members were not subject to it?
No, we are not making that judgmental call, right? We're saying it's legitimate for Indonesia to have that, and we trust the Indonesian court to be, good, right? From our side of the house, we also need to understand the fact how, this is an easy way to undermine the sovereignty that Indonesia have in the first place, right? And that's something which we think is problematic when you recognize the importance of sovereignty in itself. But moreover, we reject the idea of how you can simply give clemency in the first place, because it's a complete abandonment of the justice system which exists within that nation, and in doing so just for reasons that is completely unrelated to the crimes that these people have caused in the first place is something we are against from outside the house. It's an outside factor being used, and that completely firstly undermines the punishment in itself, but secondly undermines the justice of Indonesian law in itself, and that's something we do not like from outside the house. It's something that holds the Indonesian law is something that is reflective of the people's law. When you consider the fact that that is something that the Indonesian people wanted in the first place, we don't think it should be used as a tool to change other nations' foreign policies, which is going to change inevitably at the end of the day. So what we support from our side of the house is simple. We think that this trade-off is morally reprehensible, and the end goal is something which you can achieve under our paradigm as well. We think it doesn't have any benefit to Indonesia, and for those reasons, we're very happy to oppose.
The question that dare not speak its name in this debate is why it would be so good or so important for Andrew Chan and Yuran Sukumaran to die in the first place. The answer we get from the opposition is this. The courts of Indonesia have a mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking if you carry above a certain amount of the drug. And if you are caught and convicted, then you die. That is how it works, they say, because the traditional legal avenues of asking for clemency or asking for a pardon have not happened, therefore this person has to hang. We think that's problematic. First, we give you some reasons why we might be opposed to the killing of people in the first place. We told you that these two individuals are paragons of rehabilitation, that Yuran Sukumaran in particular has basically been used as the pilot person for a form of rehabilitation, taking distance learning degrees, becoming an artist, his time during prison, showing that perhaps he is not the person or the sort of person who committed a crime that led him to be convicted and face the death penalty. So we think there might be abstract reasons why it will be a good thing if these people walked free. We thought that they ignored those things. No. What they then said was, sure, these things are good, but it is still correct that we should follow the legal principle because we can't grant clemency in all cases, while also saying that it will be okay if Australia were to use the usual diplomatic discursive channels to influence the courts of Indonesia or to talk to Indonesia about why we could or could not have clemency in some cases. Let's be real here, Madam Speaker. Clemency is granted in all sorts of situations, right? Like the president of the nation or the head of state can pardon a prisoner from death row. What that person's motivations are irrelevant. You can pardon a criminal for reasons for like as part of a general state pardon. You can pardon your criminal because you think you can trade that off against other things that your country now finds more important. So the question here is maintaining the is this a fatal blow against the sacrosanct nature of the Indonesian legal system? And what might that blow look like? Could Indonesia sell that blow or sell this exchange as something that's not a fatal exchange of sovereignty? We think they could for a variety of reasons, and that was what we told you from the start. Why was this? So if the only reason why Indonesia wants to kill Andrew Chan and Miran Sukumaran is that they don't want to be seen as weak in the face of international oppression, this gives them an excuse to both not kill these people, maintain and build better relations with Australia, while also seeming like they're striking a blow for themselves. Because the offer that Australia makes is significant, and that's what we think the opposition was unresponsive to. We thought on the first instance, if Australia opens up its borders to international refugees, that means that the Australian Navy presumably will not continue incursions into Indonesia's territorial waters, which has always been a sticking point very recently about with the Indonesian public and the Indonesian polity, because they feel that when the Australian Navy is able to make those incursions in stopping the boats and pushing boats back within Indonesian waters, that is a stain on Indonesia's power as a naval power, on Indonesia's sovereignty even. So that's a more important issue with regards to sovereignty than whether they are able to make that step and that decision to trade off the lives of some people for other gains. But also we told you from the beginning that Indonesia doesn't want the refugee problem to fester and build up within its borders, because that is a burden on Indonesian infrastructure and the Indonesian public services. We thought in Australia comparatively was better able to do so. We didn't understand this idea that sovereign legal principles couldn't be traded off via matters outside the court. We thought it was bizarre for them to tell us that it was racist and xenophobic, when if anything it is probably a obviously non-racist and non-xenophobic policy, at least in the way that the world looks at Australia. In that Australia is now fighting not for the lives of white citizens as it has done before, but people who are Asian. But before I go, yes.
Whether or not the death penalty is good or bad
Yes.
is clearly not the debate,
Yes.
because your Australian government was not asking for the abolishment of the death penalty.
Sure.
You only asked for a pardon of individuals. So why is it that Indonesia's PR management is a relevant justification on what are the defined standards of justice by the Indonesian society?
Because those standards of justice are broached all the time. When people within that state are able to use other reasons from within that state or without that state to grant clemency to prisoners, because the judgment of a court is not absolute, because heads of states have the power to pardon. So it was not legitimate for them to tell us that once a court reaches a decision, you can't change that decision or you can't grant clemency, because you just can't. Why then was this the specific way in which we could achieve good political outcomes? They agreed with all their analysis about why refugee conditions in Australia are bad, and why if there's something that can cause refugee conditions to become better, we should probably take that. The response to say grassroots change is happening because people now dislike Tony Abbott. Yes, people do dislike Tony Abbott, but the problem in Australia is that stop the votes as a political football, as a political tool of discourse, is bipartisan. Labour, in fact, was the party who instituted the harsh stop the votes policy. It was the party which put people on Christmas Island and Vanuatu. It was the party which began the proceedings to sign a deal with Malaysia. So it's bizarre to tell me that just because Tony Abbott is now unpopular, it suggests that stop the votes is unpopular within Australia, because it is not. Basic. Maybe Australians have a greater consciousness and are not going to be as racist, so they are more likely to engender that change from within. We thought it was bizarre. Like, if we agreed that the vast majority of the Australian polity was likely to be accepting, we thought that it was incredibly difficult for them to change that, because both parties were enthralled to the forces that meant that stop the votes was powerful. Enthralled to the forces that meant that stop the votes seemed like a defense of Australian sovereignty against foreign brown people coming in from Indonesia and the Middle East. So that's why it was so powerful within Australia, and that's why we needed something equally important, the lives of two Australian citizens, to trade that off. So what do we have at the end of the day? We had a trade-off where one party, Australia, cared deeply about the lives of these two individuals, because they were Australian citizens, yes, but also because they were models for reform and rehabilitation within the prison system. So Australia wanted these people to live and to continue to represent the sorts of things Australia believed in. On the other hand, you have Indonesia, who, yes, cared about justice being done, but could could see that justice was being done anyway, because they were going to presumably go back to Australia to face some other kind of sentence, or they already served their time, and so on and so forth. The point is that they could sell that justice was being done, and they could sell that other concerns were more important. What we got in return was a breaking of the political deadlock within Australia to something that both teams agreed in this debate was unequivocally good. Madam Speaker, we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to deputy Prime Minister for his speech. Now for the call, Deputy Provost.
Let's be clear. The use of clemency and pardoning is in itself, in general, not a good thing. So it's not enough for Jan to come up here and continuously say, well, we do give clemency now for various other reasons, so therefore everything is justified and the world is fair and nice again. We think that the use of clemency to begin with subverts the justice process and just should be the most rarest and the most last resort form of usage in the country, and just shouldn't be something we encourage any president or any leader of any country to do. We're going to do three things in this speech. One, we're going to talk about relations between Indonesia and Australia and whether really they foster some kind of better relations between the two countries. Two, we're going to talk about creation of change in Australia and whether that really happens under their paradigm and why we think it works better under ours. But lastly, we're going to look at setting a terrible foreign policy precedence on this front of using things to exchange each other's lives or each other's citizens' lives for some other bigger foreign policy end goal. Let's start with good relations. We do not think on opposition that good relations between two countries should be created via intimidation and hostage taking. Principally, that's the wrong kind of relationship to create between two countries to begin with. But even if we say some sort of relationship is fair to be made via intimidation, we think it's unlikely to create those good relations in the first place. Why? Because the will of the people in Indonesia doesn't change at all, right? The people living in Indonesia and who place their faith in the Indonesian government don't gain anything from the border opening across in Australia, which means all they'll earn is that they lose their sovereign right to determine their own law and their own legal justice standards. That will anger the Indonesian people. At the same time, people who want the clemency in Australia and who are pro-humanity are not the same people who are xenophobic assholes and who will be angry by the border opening. That means there's nothing that really changes on that front in terms of Australia being nicer to Indonesia. At the end of the day, the relations in terms of will of the people translating into how foreign policy or policy end goals are created, we don't think there's any change between Indonesian and Australian relations whatsoever, because some people are made happier and some people just get angrier. So at the end of the day, relations remain the same. We don't think that changes anything for either country. Let's then go into creation of change in terms of the refugee policy in Australia. Look, global awareness has acutely changed within Australia, no matter what they try and sell you, right? It's unfair, or in fact, Jan considered this at some point, right? That the people on the ground have created different mindset about what they believe is right or wrong on this issue, on the very fact that they've been sold the truth right now. The reason why the stop the boats policy was so powerful and both parties were so for it and the rest of the population was for it is because they were fed a myth that there was some sort of line that people were jumping and it was the refugees' fault for just not following the rules and they are all, can't follow the rules of our country and they're useless. And that narrative or that myth that they were fed led to the powerful implementation of the stop the boats policy. Once you break down that myth that really there is no line, really there is no rule system that these people have been breaking, the refugees are actually the victims and not the people to be blamed. We think that when you create that narrative, the global awareness has changed and internally they will create that change for themselves and will create the kind of policy that's necessary to open the borders for these refugees to come in. So no, we don't think that it's fair that we create some sort of incentive for Australia to do the right thing when principally they're probably going to do that on their own anyway, and we don't think that that's likely. But let's make this stance clear. We think current methods for creating change in both countries are sufficient, right? We think the ability for countries to influence one another via lobby, via discourse, via international pressure is sufficient because it is fair. And it's unnecessary to diversify our methods of influence because we think there needs to be a balance between the ability to protect individual countries' sovereignty sovereignty and the ability to influence one another's foreign policies. We think what Thai government does is it creates an unfair balance to a side that skews the ability for one country to influence another country unfairly, and that is problematic. Before we go into more details on this, sure.
Regardless of whether like this is good or bad, your country and your legal system and other things within that country are more likely to be favorable if it's dealing with a national within your country also has friendly foreign relations. Why is one particular form of foreign relations or discourse or diplomacy less legitimate than another?
That assumes you prove that it actually creates friendly foreign relations first, and we don't think it's proven that at the first level. But two, we think at the end of the day, creation of foreign relations should have nothing to do with the creation of domestic policies, because creation of domestic policies are built on the rights of individual citizens and individual citizens deciding for themselves what they think they want their legal system to be about and stand for. So we don't think that that's fair. Let's begin then to this issue of setting a terrible foreign policy precedent. What Thai government policy does is it sets a standard for this kind of deal to happen again between two different countries or between Australia and a whole other group of countries. We think that's a bad kind of precedence to set because you put Australia or any other country in a situation where they can influence direct change in a different country purely by holding a country hostage and saying we will protect the citizens' lives in your country if in exchange you do something for us. Indonesia and Australia are both strong democracies with their own sovereignty and their own will of the people that they have to protect and their own right to create their own legal standards domestically. This policy creates a narrative that says any country can now step in and say, screw your own right to determine your own laws and force you into doing their bidding because you have to use clemency in order to create the change that we want. That's extremely detrimental to the very principle of self-determination that countries have. But on a more important level, it also creates a terrible legal precedence for many of these countries, right? Because you start using pardoning and clemency to gain your foreign policy end goals. It's not enough for Yan to come up here and say, well, they do it anyway. Well, they shouldn't. We don't think they should be using clemency and pardoning for foreign policy end goals. It shouldn't be that I will pardon a few of your citizens, what can you give me in return kind of exchange. We do not want countries to use that because that subverts the entire judicial process. One person or one leader saying they want to ignore and reverse the process that a fair and objective judiciary has decided upon just makes this system so much more subverted. We think Yang may say they do this now, but that's completely unacceptable because there are trickle-down harms that comes from subverting the justice process. Whether it is ensuring that deterrence doesn't happen, whether it means that ensuring closure doesn't happen. When your own people have decided that the death penalty is the right action for this group of people, and you don't actually ensure the death penalty happens, you will subvert the kinds of decisions the citizens of the country have made. You don't allow for the real pillars of justice to actually ensure, and we think that clemency is just something that shouldn't be applied in general, but particularly in cases of scenarios where citizens have come from a different country to come into my country to commit a crime. We think it's even more pervasive because you never feel the closure, because as long as a foreigner commits a crime in my country, automatically it doesn't count because another country can intimidate the country into never actually fulfilling justice against these citizens. We think that's detrimental for foreign policy, we think that's detrimental for sovereignty, and we think it's detrimental for setting up legal standards of justice for these countries. We're proud to oppose.
The last I checked, when someone comes over to me to propose a mutually beneficial exchange as an equal partner, that doesn't necessarily have to come as in an intimidating fashion. The problem with their assumption that trade-offs can't be made is that they are made every day and every moment in international politics. That's how diplomacy works. So assuming that Australia is willing to make that offer, and this we claim this is a good offer that does not in fact bully Indonesia in any way. It's not as if they said, if you do not do this, we will cut aid from you and threatening about it. It's a very much more whether or not like Indonesia accepting this deal will lead to good outcomes in general. Whereas mutually beneficial not just as judged by the countries themselves, but to all parties involved. We told you right from the start that without this exchange, both parties were stubbornly sticking to their positions for bad reasons, namely because of populist political pandering in terms of comparing PD sizes because they don't want to lose face, because of senseless showmanship. To the extent that UK told us that they thought that probably both granting of clemency to those on death row and Australia accepting refugees are wonderful things, but an agreement that brings both of these wonderful things into fruition was somehow massively harmful. We didn't really understand why. But more importantly, there was no attempt on their side to compare both considerations. They simply asserted throughout the entire team that this will necessarily be a case of Indonesia giving in to Australia for reasons they never ever seemed to be able to convince us of. And in the defense of these norms that they weren't even able to prove were a good thing, they were willing to trade off allowing refugees to languish in the seas or land on lawless Indonesian islands, to condemn these innocent people to a life of misery, suffering, and death, to be exploited by human trafficking that sells them into a life of prostitution and slavery, simply because they wanted to save face. Simply because they believe somehow that executing those people was the best way of defending our sovereignty. Not something they weren't even able to prove in the first place. Why? So why does this exchange actually create better norms, or actually creates better respect for both parties' sovereignty? And I think the logic here is as such. If both parties want something, they come together and negotiate an agreement that's mutually beneficial. They are in effect respecting each other's sovereignty, right? So to the extent that Australian Navy will no longer be able to infringe on the sovereign waters of Indonesia, making Indonesians feel threatened, making their country seem weak for not being able to fend off military forces, we say that is intimidation. That is a far worse form of sovereignty violation than a voluntary choice by a country to grant clemency, where Indonesia is equal partner to an agreement. But they said no, like Bia said, but this subverts judicial processes. My question is this: why is that bad? The only thing Bia then said was because presumably deterrence. And the fact remains that traffickers are not necessarily deterred by the death penalty. Like, think of it from a common drug trafficker perspective. Before, like, nobody wants to be a drug trafficker, right? You don't think like cost benefit analysis like Peter. Is life imprisonment better, or like is death penalty more scary? Very often they're forced into these situations because of dire circumstances that exist, so they don't take this into consideration. I don't understand why deterrence necessarily is violated. But we think to the extent that the judicial process is a bad one, we think it's a good thing perhaps in general that it is subverted. But more importantly, they then said, like, why is this beneficial for Indonesia in any way? I already explained why, like, sovereignty concerns is an issue. But presumably, like, refugees are also a problem to the extent they land on Indonesia, when Indonesia doesn't really have the capacity to manage these people, where they fall into all these, like, gangs and syndicates and, like, lend power to lawlessness within the region, make those regions harder to administer, make it harder for the Indonesian system to cope with overpopulation, for example. Right? Like, we just don't think it's a case where, like, but also the next thing they then said was, oh, but like, the leaders should respect what their citizens want. Like, so even if their citizens want certain things for wrong reasons, leaders as their representatives should still go ahead. We say it's just simply not the case in any representative democracy, and that's why we have that versus a direct democracy. We think leaders can and should make unpopular decisions if it's in the best interest of the country, and they should be given time to be judged after an entire term. That's why I think very often important economic reforms that are important in ensuring that country doesn't go into debt, and ensuring that a country can move out of depression, very often occurs at the beginning of a leader's term, for example, and that leader should be allowed to do that and then be judged on that in the long run. But the thing that they never then wanted to deal with was like was our analysis running down the team about why we think that clemency to these prisoners were a massive good. But before that, yes.
Literally every Southeast Asian country has a death penalty, and many of them have refugees going to Australia. How is it principally or morally fair to force this choice only on Indonesia?
There is no force. Indonesia is not forced to accept this offer. The offer's on the table. We're discussing whether or not Indonesia should take it or should not take it. But we're discussing about how Indonesia should exercise that choice, right? That is defined within the motion, and I just don't understand what they are saying. And we told you down the line that Australian members of the Bali Now and Death Row are exemplary examples of successful rehabilitation. And this is where I deal with this, like, judicial system, death penalty, kill people is a good thing argument, right? We told you that there was a pilot training program for prisoners. We showed that when these drug traffickers were given an opportunity, made the most of them pursue an education, right? A degree in art, to use that skill to produce art, to shed light on prison life and prison conditions, to teach and counsel fellow prisoners. We say these people are clearly repentant, clearly capable of integrating back as contributing members of society. They are no persistent threat, they have no malicious intent, and we see no reason why Indonesia should end that human life in a barbaric fashion in the first place, simply because they wanted to show something to the world that they can defy Australia for some reason. You want to talk about bad norms? We think the worst norms that are perpetuated by opposition side is this idea that we should continue to do bad things that are harmful to refugees. We should continue to kill people simply because we don't want to be seen to bend to the will of another country. We think that's not how political leaders should behave. We think that's ridiculously irresponsible. Very
The biggest fallacy coming from the side of government was that today's policy was apparently a mutually beneficial exchange. But wait a minute. Both sides agreed that the stop the votes policy was atrocious and should rightfully be reversed and illegitimate on all counts. But both sides agreed that this debate is not about whether or not the death penalty is good or bad, it's just the fact that it is legitimate. So we asked them, why does Indonesia have to sacrifice a legitimate sovereign policy for you, Australian government, to rightfully remove their illegitimate policies, even in absence of your preference of this trade-off? We see Australia should rightfully be pressured to remove this policy, and Indonesia shouldn't be made to sacrifice a rightfully sovereign national policy that is legitimate just for the sake of you having to save the people that you can, under your sovereign decision, choose to save anyways. But secondly, we told you in the first speech, Australia's refugee policy is a global problem that requires a common solution, that requires every party to input international pressure. So why is Indonesia, as one of the smaller stakeholders within this interaction, is the only stakeholder that is forced to make a significant sacrifice? We tell you from the get-go that Indonesia has little to gain from this transaction. This was not a mutually beneficial exchange. And before the questions, to be clear, we had an assertion coming from the speaker before me, guys, keep quiet, that Indonesia is making a free choice, Mr. Speaker. It's not. This is not a free choice when you're telling them if you don't make this choice, and under your own argument, they are seen as murderers who had the capacity to stop the death across the borders, but decided to not make that decision. You were compelling this sovereign government to make the decision because you told them this is a PR disaster that will completely ruin their foreign relations. Under what circumstances are those incentives called making a free choice for Indonesia? We say very much your offer is compelling Indonesia to make that choice. We think it's a highly unfair victimization of Indonesia within this trade-off. Two questions. Firstly, can political change be achieved without using human lives as a barter between nations? Secondly, does this in fact improve foreign relations for Indonesia? Let's look at political change, because apparently we want the same things. We want the stop the policy to be reversed. But what we heard coming from UK, we never heard a sufficient response, is that while alternatives that are extremely viable under status quo have to be abandoned, and Indonesia has to make a unique sacrifice to achieve the same goals that we want. We told you this alternative not only is viable, it has in fact gained massive traction over the last year. We told you Australians are being put under the limelight of global scrutiny. What we heard from Myanmar was, no, the stop the policy was bipartisan and extremely popular. We agree. It doesn't change our response that the change that was created was that the Australian locale made an acute realization that the jumping the queue rhetoric that was shoved down their mouth is actually a myth. There's no such thing as a queue when it comes to asylum seekers because there's no UN registry when it comes to areas of conflict. Everyone that comes to the border are asylum seekers. They don't have to bring documentation. The Australian government, both parties, will lie to them. That realization has in fact proved that progression can happen and also that international pressure to create those changes can happen. So if what you want and what we both want can happen under status quo, the question is, why should Indonesia make that personal sacrifice when it is a global problem that requires a common solution? They did not want to answer this unfair barter. Additionally, they argue that there is benefits to Australia's humanitarian stance. We think the time argued for that was completely moot because the clash is, coming clearly from Yuki, is how does the Australian government choose to lobby for this change? We told you two things. If Australia really wants to lobby for anti-death penalty and save its own people, sovereign governments are allowed to fund local movements in other countries in order to persuade those sovereign governments into making a free and fair choice, into making policy changes. That's what sovereign governments do, guys. We have discourse, we have political engagement. We don't say if you don't make this choice, the ransom is people will die at borders. It was completely your fault to me. But secondly, we don't even buy the stance that Australia has an amazing pro-humanitarian stance because you didn't ask for the abolishment of the death penalty. You asked for the pardon of only your Australian citizens, which is why the recharacterization for opposition was particularly important. It is not a humanitarian lobby. It is a manipulative political tool that was meant for convenience in order to get the changes that they want in another country that they had no power to force the change of. On a comparative take a seat, we didn't hear a cogent response towards our harm on why their policy is a manipulative political tool that undermines sovereignty. You're the ones possibly pushing for the government to change a policy with no consideration on what the people actually want that policy to be like. When we pointed to that the legal justice system must consider the social construct, their response was, well, we bastardize the system all the time, therefore that must make this strategy extremely legitimate. No, guys, there's a trickle-down effect because when you alter legal justice policies with no consideration of what the people want, you abolish the death penalty with considerations of lesser deterrence within society, lesser social closure for society, lesser retribution in the eyes of society. In all of these elements, justice was not seen to be done in the eyes of the Indonesian society. The purpose of sovereignty was to make laws that cater for the individuals within your local borders to see that justice is being done. So they are trickle-down effects, guys, and you didn't want to bother to discuss it. You just said that it's okay to do this because you do it all the time. That's not a good enough response. Secondly, does this improve foreign relations for Indonesia? Before that, yes.
So, international pressure is a good actor to influence Australia to change its refugee policy, but Australian pressure is not a good actor to influence Indonesia to change its domestic policy. Why?
It is what type of pressure are you inputting? We told you discourse in terms of having lobbying is good because no one is compelled to make a decision. When you lobby the lives of individuals that these people will die at our borders, if you don't make a call right now, that is being held at ransom, that is a manipulative political tool. Does this improve foreign relations? The trade-off on that side of the house was nearly a big PR campaign. They said if Australia threatens to cut aid from Indonesia, if Australia puts their navy and threaten the borders of Indonesia, these people will be seen as weak. No, it is not. When we are being attacked by Australia, when we are being actively intimidated by Australia, making that political concession is what makes us seem weak, Mr. Speaker. That concession means that we didn't have free choice and we are succumbing to your demands rather than meeting in the middle of what demands are actually mutually beneficial for the both of us. You're saying that Indonesia will be seen as the bad psychos simply because they wanted to save face. That's a contradiction, because if you said that they wanted to save face, then they would have done it already under status quo, right? You're claiming for benefits that are incoherent with your model in the first place. Let's look at our house that we're not engaged with on that side of the house, because we told you fair foreign policies and an improvement of foreign relations means it should not include intimidation tactics within political negotiations, because there's already one case for us to take hostages and put lives at cost when we're talking to people such as terrorists. Terrorists are illegitimate, they refuse to participate in political discourse. But in this debate, this is Australia and Indonesia, who are both sovereign parties who are allies with each other. These two parties now are legitimizing that these kinds of interaction is a proper interaction within the international sphere of relations. That's an unacceptable precedent on that side of the house. But secondly, we don't know why, in their PR campaign, that as long as we can sell the idea of justice to the Indonesian people, then that's sufficient. We don't want the Indonesian government to try and sell anything. We want them to be truthful to its own people and ask, when we make laws for you, what do you want those laws to be like? Because that is the responsibility of the Indonesian government, not to be held at the behest of another sovereign government and sacrificing the local will of those societies. We're very proud to oppose. Alfred conceded very explicitly that this is a deal that we are putting on Indonesia's table for mutual benefit and not for anything else. So all of the humanitarian distance learning of the poor prisoner bullshit that the other two people spewed on that team had absolutely no relevance to the rest of this debate, because there is no humanitarian end goal here, and Alfred conceded that this was a political trade-off, and purely a political trade-off between Australia and Indonesia. Therefore, should Indonesia take the deal? It should, only if they gain more than they personally lose. Because if not, then that's just not a fair trade for Indonesia, and Indonesia should reject the deal and should stick to continuing to continue the death penalty for their people. So let's look what Edward's on offer in this deal. The creation of a policy in Australia that's likely to happen anyway, because the global awareness within Australia has changed to the point where this policy is going to be reversed anyway, because the lie that the individual citizens on the ground have been fed in Australia has been revealed, and the global awareness has changed, and people on the ground within Australia are probably going to reverse this very stop the votes policy on their own, without the incentive and without the push to do this to begin with, in exchange for going against a fair, objective trial that decided that the death penalty was the fair sentence for these two individuals, and subverting the end goals of the Indonesian justice system that has decided in a fair manner that the death penalty was appropriate. What is the benefit for Indonesia in either ends of those deals? We don't think this is a fair deal for Indonesia. We in fact think this is a lose-lose situation for Indonesia, because they gain literally no benefit from their policy. So let's assume that this is really just a trade-off. We think side opposition has already won this debate. But let's look at the assumptions they really wanted to build this debate upon, and assume that everything in Alfred's speech was actually a lie and we're debating Jan and Shermi's paradigm, right? That really this is a humanitarian issue and we want to remove the death penalty in Indonesia, and it's important to show rehabilitation as an end goal. It's strange for them to assume that any judicial process that ends in a death penalty sentence is automatically a bad one. We think that at the end of the day, individual citizens can decide for themselves, or individual countries can decide for themselves, what they think is appropriate penalty or appropriate punishment for crimes that happen within their own land. We do not think that any other country on the planet has the right to step into a different country and say, we think what you people think is stupid, here is what real law should look like. We think that kind of intimidation and that kind of
forcing of your own opinions on a different country is unfair, and we think that that kind of manipulation is setting the wrong kind of precedence for another country. It's easy for him at the end to come up here and say, well, you know what, it's even more intimidation if the Australian Navy chooses to breach Indonesian waters. It's not more of an intimidation, it's just as bad intimidation. Both of those forms of intimidation are equally bad for Australia to undertake, and they shouldn't be intimidating any country that way. We think that the Australian Navy breaching Indonesian waters is one of those intimidations that's not going to happen anyway, because the Stop the Boats policy's reversal means that intimidation will be removed. We think that's a good kind of precedence to set. The kind of precedence that says you let each country form their own policies for their own reasoning, and that's a good thing. But even if it was the case that you think that another country's judicial process is bad, that you think that they're not following the real rules, we think it's unfortunate for them to think that because you think another country's judicial process is bad, therefore it's okay to subvert it by offering them something they would have gotten anyway in exchange for what you want. We think that's a bad deal that's put on the table, and we think that Indonesia didn't want to not give clemency for fear of looking weak. Hell, that was never the case for Indonesia. It wasn't about looking weak. At the end of the day, it was about doing what their own people wanted, what was right for their own citizens, and what was right for the putting forward of their own principles and their own values. We think this is a bad deal, and we think Indonesia shouldn't take it.
Madam Speaker, in an ideal world, like maybe a world where everyone in the world is high on pot, things would just be good, right? Like people would be granted clemency because the governments were perfectly, in all cases, able to decide who deserves clemency and who didn't deserve clemency. Australia would treat its refugees with great care. They wouldn't have to sail across rickety boats and risk being turned back in the process and all that. This is not an ideal world. This is a world where Australia is unlikely to reverse that policy, where it being unlikely to reverse that policy means incursions into Indonesian territorial waters, means people being put in bad conditions. It is also a world where Indonesia has concerns about its judicial sovereignty and like its own justice system, but also has other interests at stake, such as not having refugees clog up its own infrastructure. There are two questions in this debate. First, on rehabilitation and refugee politics. So the attendant benefits that we talked about from the start, do they happen? Can they happen otherwise? And then there was a second bigger question as to whether we could in fact grant clemency and whether doing so might be problematic separately. So to the first question. So the first thing we said, and this, to be fair and to be clear, wasn't the focus of the debate. We weren't seeking to overturn the death penalty altogether, like we were as agnostic as they were about whether the death penalty was good in all cases or some cases, but we also told you that it was clear in these cases, specifically on Andrew Chan and Miran Sukumaran, that the death penalty was probably a bad punishment because they were epitomes of rehabilitation and reform. They had changed their characters from the individuals they originally were. They were able to integrate into society. They didn't really dispute. It's just it didn't matter because we needed to apply the law in all circumstances, which was basically the second question of the debate. But we thought it was unequivocal. It was probably unequivocally good if that question was problematic and these two people were. The next question was refugee politics. And we told you that the Stop the Boats narrative in Australia causes a host of problems, which they agreed with, and that it couldn't be changed via normal Australian political means. Their response was to tell us that it could, because people in Australia have changed their mindset. Firstly, it was Tony Abbott is our topic, which we did. And then to tell us that people in Australia no longer believe the myth of the queue jungle. We thought that was quite unresponsive to our idea that if both major political parties who have any hope of changing anything within Australia continue to be enthralled to narratives about national security, not just queue jumping, and these narratives continue to be powerful with powerful members within those parties, nothing was going to change in Australia, despite international pressure, despite the sorts of things that it was somehow okay with, like when it applied to Australia and not Indonesia. So the second question then was, can clemency be granted, and what sorts of forms can we conduct international diplomacy? We told you that it was a plausible and a fair trade where Indonesia stood to benefit. Australia obviously stood to benefit because it wanted these two people to live. And Indonesia also stood to benefit, not presumably because like it was now held to ransom over the potential PR loss of like causing the death of thousands of refugees, but because of two crucial things. Because it now knew that with the assurance of this deal, Indonesia's sovereignty, which was important in Indonesia and Indonesian people, would no longer be reached, and because its own economic conditions within Indonesia would no longer be harmed by a flood of refugees who were being pushed back within Indonesia. So these were two clear benefits for Indonesia, and Indonesian leaders can and should take into consideration. They said the particular form of diplomacy is problematic because you're trading two things with each other explicitly. We think explicit trade-offs or implicit trade-offs take place all the time. International pressure via diplomatic or discursive channels is a form of trade-off. How else is this offer made if not in diplomatic writing, when you write to someone and pressure them to do a particular thing? We didn't think that the difference in form was particularly important, and crucially we thought when they said that Indonesia's own legal system has to be respected because it's representative of the Indonesian people, we told you that the representative of the Indonesian people was the Indonesian head of state, who presumably had the power to make that decision, as he did in other cases when heads of state grant pardons to citizens. So because we could give clemency, because giving clemency in this particular form of trade-off would lead to massively good outcomes that both sides agreed with, we're very proud to propose.